know what? I want to stay with what you just opened up another avenue of inquiry in the last comment that you made. I want to stay with it because I think that we don't talk enough about that. Give me some examples that you've seen on a personal level of what you just mentioned about that resistance or that doesn't enable that man to really evolve as fully as they could.
Oh, there's so many. Where do I pick, right? I would say on a personal front, one of the things that I see that's very resonant, it has been resonant in my life, but I also see it being very resonant right now in the worlds in which I travel with client systems and friends and colleagues, is what happens to men and their partners around income generation. So when you look at the numbers of women who are ascending, right, into senior roles or professional roles where their income may actually be higher than men, we see more men in a position, more young men today in a position to be primary at home. Because if you have the privilege of having a parent to be home taking care of kids, especially right now in COVID, when kids are at home with both working parents are making really hard trade-offs to say, okay, well, who should be home?
Oh,
And I remember when I was a young professional, my income was primary. And yet I often stayed home also. And yet my job was the most important because I felt the double bind that women often feel, which is I have to do both jobs really well. And I remember a conversation with my kid's dad all those many years ago about, hang on a second, let's rethink this, right? I'm making more money. When a kid is sick, what would it mean if you were home? If you took the day off, or in a period where he was out of work, if you were the primary parent. And the tension for him was enormous. And it wasn't that he didn't love our children and he wasn't a good caretaker and he didn't want to be. He was a great dad. He was a
right.
fabulous caretaker. But he talked about a story in his head, which is like, that's not the way it's supposed to be. You're
Yep.
not supposed to be the one making the money. And so that story in his head was a real barrier in terms of identity. Who am I? Am I a good man if I'm staying at home with our kids? And then if I do that, where do I build community? Because I go to the playground and go to the school, it's all women who are at home. Now
Yep.
I had the same tensions where I was like, yeah, and I'm the mom who can't volunteer at school, which was, my guilt and shame. But his guilt and shame was more around this provider mantra. And I see that happening even today, where we have young men and women, or men with male partners who are saying, one of us needs to be primary for the kid. And it can be really hard for society to uplift and support men as primary caregivers, like that they can take care of elderly parents or children. So that has both a personal and a professional for me. And we see in corporations, we see that even with the proliferation of paternity leave for men, most men don't take it, or they don't take all of it. They take a few days. So even though the law has made parental leave equal, it's not being equally exploited, by men and women because of, I think, some of that bias about caregiving. I think in the workplace where we sometimes see the tensions are that men are male leaders. I'll use an example of male leaders because I see this quite often, Joe. I'm sure you do too. Male leaders who are, they're good men, they're well-intentioned, they want to have an inclusive culture. And yet they have blind spots that they aren't paying attention to. And so they maybe get aware of something like a political incident happens or something goes on with a person of color or a woman in their team, and they don't know what to do. They don't know what to do. They know they should do or say something, but they don't know what to do. And oftentimes what I see happen is men will choose then to do nothing. They'll do nothing. An example I'm remembering a client described to me was that he was a CEO and he had a VP who was African-American, who was devastated by the George Floyd murder, came to work that day red-eyed, very, very traumatized. And the CEO, who was a white male, saw this happening and knew, like, okay, there's something bad happening to a team member of mine. What do I do? And didn't know what to do, didn't know how to bridge that gap with empathy, and so did nothing. About 3 weeks later, that VP turned in his resignation. His stated reason was, I don't feel seen. I'm the only Black man here. And when this devastating situation happened that impacted me and other people like me worldwide, my boss, the CEO, didn't even care enough to acknowledge what he saw in me. Now, that white CEO was shocked when that message happened. He was shocked that this employee resigned, and he was shocked that he had a role in it, because his model, his story that he told himself was, the best thing I can do is just keep my head down and keep on working, right? Rather than finding a way to bridge the divide, which would have been very vulnerable. It would have required some real humanity and connection to check in with his colleague. How are you doing today? This news is bad, and I wonder how you're doing. And I think what he said to me, what that white CEO said to me was, I was taught to not see color, Mo. So I figured I didn't want to treat him any different than anyone else. And I understand the intention, Joe, as I'm sure you do. And yet it was a misfire. And in this case, he needed to see color because he had a Black colleague, a Black employee who desperately needed to be seen for what he was going through. So I think those are some of the places where, for men, in this case for white men, it is a real compelling call to do the work that would have prepared him to meet that colleague in a more authentic, more open-hearted, more empathetic way for his lived experience.
Yeah, no, that's a great story. And so many other questions and ideas come out of that.